the last months of 1944, most in the Allied command thought the Nazi war machine had been destroyed. But Hitler had a surprise in store and delivered it just in time for Christmas. His last massive gamble to win the war would be a 50-hour blitzkrieg to cut his enemy's lines in two. Crucial to his plan was taking the town of Bastogne. But standing in his way was a remarkable US unit, the all-black 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Besieged and low on ammunition, the 333rd would have to hold Bastogne. If it failed, Hitler's fight back would succeed. In December 1944, the Allies thought the Nazis were finished. The euphoria after D-Day still lingered, and they thought Hitler would soon have to surrender. Many talked of being back home by the end of the year. A mood of thanksgiving settled over Western Europe, as many got into the Christmas spirit. Among them, and posted on the front line, was one of the US Army's more unusual units. An all-black force of 400 gunners, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Black faces were a rarity in the US Army at the time, and black fighters even more so. But the men who had signed up to fight the racist ideology of the Nazis also faced racism on their own side. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, 10 million conscripts were drafted, large numbers of them African Americans, eager to prove themselves as fighting men. But any illusions they might have had about fighting for their country would not last long. When it came to killing Germans, most in the US Army thought only white men were up to it.
African American soldiers were used mainly in non-combat roles. So they would be given, it was actually drudge work that would be given during World War II. They would be asked to drive service vehicles, dig ditches for the engineers. The lowest kind of menial work, because they weren't considered fit to be combat troops. African-American soldiers were subjected to extreme racism.
The few black combat troops that did exist were a rarity, even by the end of World War II. They made up fewer than 3% of all fighting men and were kept in segregated all-black units, led by white officers. George Shomo was 22 when he headed from his home in the relatively liberal state of New Jersey. When he arrived in Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, he wouldn't have long to wait before he got his first taste of Southern racism.
Camp Gruber and the South was very prejudiced. And you just had to live with it. Being from the North, I never knew what prejudice was until I went South. If you got a chance to go into town in Oklahoma, you were limited to one street. And if you strayed off of that street 9 times out of 10, you were beat up. It was a big shock, because in New Jersey, I could go wherever I wanted to go. No questions asked. Nobody stuck a gun up your nostrils or anything like that.
The white commander of Camp Gruber wasted no time in telling his new black recruits what he thought of them and what they could expect of their time in the 333rd.
When we first hit Camp Gruber, he told us we could call him a racist, cracker, whatever we wanted to call him, but we was all his little pickaninnies. And you couldn't get out of the outfit because there were no transfers, and the only way you get out of the outfit is die. That was it. That's what you had to accept.
Left and hut. Five facing right now, parade, rest hand, troops, 10 arms, ready, exercise. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
With all black ranks and white officers, race tensions were routine. White officers expected to be hated, but in one section, its captain devised an unusual way of dealing with discontent among his subordinates.
Captain McLeod knew of the rumbling that was going on about the officers. And he came out in the formation one morning and said that anybody that didn't like him, wanted to fight him, you take off your shirt, I'll take off mine. If you win, I'll shake your hand. If I win, I expect you to shake my hand, and it's all over with. Nobody accepted. And from then on, I'd say 99% of the fellas in the company liked him.
MacLeod had won the respect of his men and the admiration of George. It was a bond that remained for the rest of the war and would ultimately save the officer's life. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was charged with operating the 155mm howitzer, a fearsomely accurate field gun with a range of 10 miles that could fire a shell every 15 seconds. It was built for a fast-moving land war, light enough for its crews to move quickly, blast enemy positions, then move again. In the right hands, it made a devastating complement to the troops it was designed to support.
Gunners would have prided themselves on the speed at which they could set up their artillery pieces. So they literally would be able to do this within a matter of 3 minutes. This quick, responsive fire was something that artillery batteries would compete one against another. Who would have the best times? Who would bring rounds on target the most quickly?
After a year's training, the 333rd headed to Europe and Normandy. D-Day was their first taste of war. Some days after the first invasion, they landed on a coast that was anything but secure. They suddenly found themselves throwing out the rule book and improvising with the howitzers as they'd never been trained to. It would prove a very useful introduction to the months ahead.
We came at Utah Beach. There were still bodies all over the place. And we practically fought our way in with the big guns. You lowered the barrel and aimed them like you had a rifle.
As the Allies pushed into France, the 333rd wouldn't have to wait for long to get a chance to prove themselves. The German stronghold at La Haye-de-Puy had to be crushed, and artillery would be crucial in the fight. Enemy forces held 2 hills outside the town, itself packed with snipers from the crack German divisions. The forces defending the hills inflicted appalling losses on the US infantry, who finally prevailed. But as the Americans closed in for the final assault, their way into the town was stopped by a troublesome Tiger tank. The artillery moved fast and, at a mile distant, took on a task that would be a challenge for even the most experienced gunners. Now the Black Battalion showed what they could do with a well-aimed howitzer. And felled the Tiger with a single shell.
The gunners wrote a message on the shells concerning Hitler, and one of the shells went down the turret of the tank, which made all the newspapers in the Army. Our outfit was the only outfit that ever done it. It was fantastic. Everybody was happy. They wanted to shoot another one.
This had been their first taste of glory, but the 333rd were hardly veterans. Now the Allies broke into France, pushing back the German occupation, all the way to the landmark prize of Paris. After the liberation of Belgium, a vast front, 1,000 miles long, opened up before the Allies that needed to be defended. Keeping the Germans behind it now stretched manpower as never before, and soon another problem reared up. Supply lines were nearly at breaking point.
The advancing Allied armies outran their supply lines. They simply had to slow down. They had exceeded the distance at which their rate of advance could be supplied adequately. If you think of this advancing force of thousands and thousands of Allied tanks, they are consuming fuel at an enormous rate. The deeper they go into enemy territory, the longer the fuel has to be provided. It would be the same with food. It would be the same with spare parts, clothing, anything it would take to supply an army. There's a significant strategic consumption that's involved.
Now the European winter ground down the Allied advance. First rains turned the land into a bog, then the lowest temperatures in 38 years froze it. The black gunners of the 333rd dug in on the mountainous forests of eastern Belgium, called the Ardennes. Gripped by bitter cold winter, they were hard against the quietest part of the German front. They were there to support the 106th Infantry, a division of novice troops hastily formed to bulk up numbers. An icy calm settled over the region, and the sparsely scattered units of the 106th and the 333rd dubbed their posting the Ghost Front. It would be a catastrophic misnomer. For the Ghost Front was anything but ghostly. Just a stone's throw from the raw recruits of the 106th, Hitler was silently and stealthily assembling a vast army. For months, in the confident afterglow of D-Day, the Allies had dismissed Hitler's capacity to rearm. But the German tank factories had been running white-hot, increasing their production to the highest in the entire war. Meanwhile, new infantry were recruited and armed with the latest weaponry. Thousands of tons of tanks and artillery were quietly assembled in the forests, right under the noses of the Allied troops. Scattered reports of the sounds of artillery movements from behind enemy lines filtered up to Allied HQ, only to be dismissed. And as the GIs got ready for Christmas, the Nazis got ready for war. Hitler's plan was to summon his last reserves and throw everything he had at the Allies. And he chose a plan of breathtaking boldness for what history would come to know as the Battle of the Bulge. In classic Blitzkrieg style, he ordered 4 huge armies across the Western Front at lightning speed. The Northern and Southern armies would protect the flanks of the central attack. That would drive as fast as possible through the mountain forests of Belgium along a complex network of roads. Half the attack would take Bastogne. Beyond Bastogne, the river Meuse and the road to the key port of Antwerp.
Hitler's plan was to cross the Meuse River quickly, ideally within a day, and then drive toward the key port of Antwerp. This was the plan, and it would split the British to the north and the Americans to the south.
Antwerp's port was one of the few still working in Europe. It was the Allies' lifeline, and if Hitler seized it, he'd have his enemies by the throat. Hitler gathered his most hardened fighters. Among them, the fanatical Waffen-SS, the military wing of the Nazi Party, led by his personal favorites. General Hasso von Manteuffel, a highly decorated tactical genius who would be charged with taking Brussels with the 5th Panzer Army. SS General Joseph Dietrich, a Nazi hardman, and once Hitler's bodyguard, would lead the 6th Panzer Army. His destination? Antwerp. Under Dietrich, one of the rising stars of the army, the fanatical Jochen Peiper. Still in his 20s, he led an SS unit so formidable it was named after the Führer himself. In a dazzling career, he'd also won some of the highest honors the Reich could bestow. Now he would command a specialist strike force of the 70-ton King Tiger tanks. As the countdown to the battle approached, a deathly hush settled over the forests concealing the Reich's last great bid for victory.
From the 12th of December, they'd ordered a radio silence. So there were going to be no messages transmitted between battalions, between divisions. Everything was going to be done by runners, people handing messages to each other. So for 3 days before the battle, they'd maintained total radio silence, and nobody had an inkling.
In the early hours of December the 16th, the Germans attacked. A 48-hour barrage of artillery erupted with devastating power. And with a front row seat, the forward observers of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. While the Americans tried to grasp the scale of the situation, specialist SS units disguised as GIs went behind the lines and attacked. Soldiers, just out of training camp, who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, suddenly didn't know friend from foe. Panic and paranoia ripped through the lines, but this was just the beginning.
The 333rd found themselves in the path of the 1st Division SS, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. These were the standard bearers of Adolf Hitler. So I think it's fair to say that these lads were pretty radical. They'd actually been given an agenda before they set off. They'd been told to subjugate your enemy by whatever means. That meant no holds barred. You did what you thought fit. They were going to write the battle by their rules in the field.
Now the two main panzer armies descended. The 106th, with no combat experience and 5 days in the area, received orders to counterattack. They faced Jochen Peiper and SS troops hardened by years on the Russian front. They were outnumbered 10-1.
Against these 4 divisions, at most some 80,000 men, Hitler had amassed over 400,000 men, and some of them are the best troops available with the newest equipment, the best tanks in line.
The divisions who were here in the supposedly quiet Ardennes were actually covering wider ground than they should have been, because according to the US service manual issued in World War II, a division front was 5 miles. Well, in the case of the 106th Division, which incorporated the 333rd, they were covering an area of over 26 miles, so they were far too thinly spread for a start.
It was a short-lived resistance. 2 of the division's 3 regiments gave up immediately. It was the biggest American surrender of the war, with over 6,000 men falling into German hands at once. With the 106th in disarray, it was time for the 333rd to get out, while leaving a small unit to give covering fire. This meant a tough decision.
All the company commanders had a meeting, and somebody had to stay behind so the rest could pull out. And Captain McLeod got the short straw. So we knew we couldn't go nowhere.
Just over 100 gunners were left with Captain MacLeod, with no idea of what was about to hit them. As the forest swarmed with Hitler's advancing armies, they were utterly alone, and one of them was George Shomo.
The fighting was very hard, very fierce. It was like Custer's last stand, you might say. The guns, most of them were out of order. We had the carbine rifles and sidearms, 45 gun pistols, that's all we had left. Food went first, ammunition went next. I can remember killing about 3 Germans with a trench knife. I figured I may be killed. I never expected to be captured. Because I knew what the German mind was as far as black troops, so we all figured we was gonna die, so what the hell, die fight.
George and his comrades may have been ready to fight to the death, but their captain knew he had to save his men. With every last bullet spent, there was only one course of action.
MacLeod had told me he was going to have to surrender to try to save lives because we didn't have nothing left to fight with. The Germans had to step over piles of their dead to get to us, believe me. We fought and took as many of them as we could.
George was now a prisoner of war and completely at the mercy of some of the most fanatical Nazis in the German army. It was not a prospect to be relished by the black gunners. And the Germans lost no time in making the most of their African-American captives for propaganda purposes.
Immer wieder das gleiche Bild. Vorgehende deutsche Kolonnen, Gefechtsfahrzeuge, Nachschub, Trosse auf der einen Seite und Dreierkolonnen marschierender weißer und schwarzer Amerikaner auf der anderen Seite.
Amid the confused and exhausted faces entertaining the German audiences was that of Staff Sergeant George E. Shomo.
I knew what it was all about. It was propaganda. I knew that. And it didn't bother me. I said, hell, who's going to see the pictures anyhow? Probably just Hitler.
It soon became clear what kind of enemy now controlled the fate of George and his comrades.
The SS troopers looked down on us. They hated our guts, the same as they did Jews. There was a lot of white soldiers from the 106th Infantry Division that were prisoners with us. And they, I don't know, it was something about the looks or their names. Soldiers of Jewish origin, they pulled them aside and they took them someplace else. I never knew what happened to him.
George and the men who fought to the last with him were quickly marched to railheads and transported to camps deep within Germany to await their fate. Meanwhile, the rest of the 333rd, the men whose withdrawal George had covered, fled west to American lines. Some were captured, others made it back, and others floundered in the Arctic conditions. A tiny band of 11 gunners, split off in the first wave of battle, struggled on, lost in territory crawling with German infantry.
They would have almost nothing. To begin with, they might not have been that well supplied in terms of winter clothing. And now what they did have, perhaps in a dugout or maybe a well-fortified position, they've left that all behind. And with it, they've left all of their personal belongings, all of their extended clothing, anything that would help them survive in the elements.
The 11 men were lost in dense woodland and ravines. If they didn't find shelter, it would only be a matter of time before exposure would kill them all. They could have died in the snows, but then stumbled on the hamlet of Wereth. It was their only chance of survival, but throwing themselves on the mercies of the local population was a very risky thing to do.
This German-speaking part of Belgium, Berg-Reuland, the people weren't entirely sure, are we German, are we Belgian? Because the nationality had changed when the Germans had invaded in May 1940. Either way, they wouldn't have got much encouragement from the population. I think that's fair to say as well. Because what you have to bear in mind is that African Americans were considered to be Untermenschen by the Germans. So they were regarded as less than human beings, in the same way they regarded Gypsies, Jews, and Slavonics. This made the situation incredibly tenuous for these guys.
They were in luck. A farmer, Matthias Langer, gave them food, warmth, and critically, shelter. For the Langer family, with no clear idea who had the upper hand in battle, helping US soldiers was an act of incredible bravery. Meanwhile, word had got around the village that American soldiers were hiding out at Matthias Langer's farm. And it was not long before an SS scouting party paid the farmer a visit. The men were taken back to the woodland they'd come from. What happened next only became clear many weeks later. For the remaining men of the 333rd, it was now simply a question of survival. Shattered and leaderless, they struggled back to the only safe haven they knew, the regional headquarters in Bastogne. But any hopes that their troubles were over were soon dashed, for Bastogne was about to become the epicenter of the biggest battle in US history.
Bastogne was crucial to the German offensive. It's the main offensive initially was the northern shoulders, Zepp Dietrich, the 6th Panzer Army that is largely stopped in the north. In the south, Hasso von Manteuffel and the 5th Panzer Army make much better progress. As a result, the main effort for the German attack is shifted to the south. The main obstacle is Bastogne. Bastogne was a key hub because its road network proved essential to the area.
Racing towards it were the feared divisions of the Panzer Lehr, Germany's elite tank army. Backing it up, the 47th Panzer Corps, with its 2 divisions of crack Waffen-SS tank regiments, supported by regular infantry. Without reinforcements, the town would fall instantly.
If the Germans could get there quickly, they would secure a major road network that would allow them to keep their forces pushing forward. If the Americans could defend Bastogne sufficiently, they would put a major delay in the German assault. The key is time for both the Americans and the Germans.
The Germans were racing towards Bastogne, and the US had to beat them, but everything was against the Allies. nearest elite force was the US 101st Airborne, the paratroops called the Screaming Eagles. But with weather making airdrops impossible, they were grounded. The only way of getting to Bastogne, open trucks on icebound roads. And racing them for the prize, von Manteuffel's elite panzers, now hours from rolling into the town.
After the German initial attack, few American senior leaders realized how significant an offensive this was. But within 24 hours, they have figured it out. And word goes out to the field, hold at all costs. Stop, delay, withdraw, but only under pressure. Even maintaining strong points, pocket defenses, would be essential to delaying the German offensive.
The Panzer Lehr hurled themselves through the Ardennes. US roadblocks slowed them, slightly, but just enough. For when they swept down to Bastogne, they were greeted by the newly arrived Screaming Eagles. Bastogne may now have been reinforced, but the Germans were attacking all around, taking outlying villages and shelling the town in a relentless assault. As the 101st Airborne dug in, they were quickly introduced to their second enemy, the coldest winter for decades.
Out in the forests around Bastogne, the 101st Division, who were dug in foxholes, were experiencing temperatures of minus 28 Celsius. Now, inside the city itself, the conditions were in fact horrendous. The civilians and the US soldiers who were there took on a kind of troglodyte subterranean lifestyle. They were living in cellars. And in some cases, they would knock holes from one cellar to the next, and this is how they would get around. It was simply too dangerous to be above ground.
Grey skies prevented airdrops of supplies. The defenders were fast running out of ammunition. Still reeling amid the chaos, the 333rd were quickly put to work. The Screaming Eagles commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, ordered them into the forests outside Bastogne to keep the pressure on the encircling Germans. But panic was beginning to seize the exhausted gunners. When rumors raced along the lines that Bastogne had fallen, the battalion commander ordered a retreat. Horrified, McAuliffe instantly ordered them back. But German forces were now pressing in, and as they closed the circle, the black gunners fell into Bastogne's perimeter and a siege that would test them to the limit. A grim joke started the rounds, reflecting the dogged spirit of the encircled men. They've got us surrounded, the poor bastards. The bitter cold and hunger menaced not just the 333rd, but also their captured comrades marching to German prison camps. Just staying alive was now their best hope.
They marched us all through these little towns, propaganda stuff, you know. People stoned us, hit us with sticks. We walked for 4 or 5 days, no food, no water, except you grab a handful of snow. And if one of the German guards saw you doing that, he hit you with a rifle butt or stuck you with a bayonet. The only thing I was worrying about was the cold, how long I was gonna last out there in the cold, sleeping in the snow and stuff.
For George and his companions, cold, hunger, and disease would be constant companions, with no end in sight. Back in Bastogne, between the twin threats of cold and encircling Germans, a transformation started to take place. Race prejudice was becoming a luxury few could afford. Killing the enemy was all that mattered, and the Black Battalion showed themselves every bit as good at it as their white counterparts. But courage would only get them so far.
They were running out of everything. They were running out of food, they were running out of medical supplies, they were running out of, more importantly, ammunition. Now, the chaps from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion were told to ration themselves to 10 artillery shots a day. That's how bad it was getting.
With no air support or supply drops, the Americans held out for relief, and the Germans closed in ever more tightly. The Germans were now convinced that the besieged American forces were all but defeated. General von Lüttwitz appealed to McAuliffe to admit he was finished and offered to accept an American surrender. He didn't have to wait long for an answer. The US general, seeing the ultimatum, muttered one word: nuts, and then decided to make that his official response. Morale among the GIs soared for a while. For behind the bravery, the reality was that the siege was at crisis point. On Christmas Eve, the Germans bombed a hospital, killing 20 patients and a Belgian nurse. The normally sanguine McAuliffe urged his superiors to send reinforcements immediately and hoped they would arrive by Christmas Day. George Shomo's Christmas was spent in a prison camp. Around him, survivors of the Battle of the Bulge, succumbing to the bitter cold.
Quite a few of them died in the prison camp. They made it through the war per se, but they couldn't survive the prison camps.
His duties in the camp kitchen had given him a chance of survival and the opportunity to help his comrades. Among them, his captain, the inspirational officer who had impressed him back in Oklahoma and led his unit through the battle.
Captain McLeod was ill, and I used to smuggle extra soup to him in his barracks to try to keep him alive anyhow, and it worked.
In Bastogne, fierce fighting continued through Christmas with no sign of relief. The troops were now calling themselves the battered bastards of Bastogne, and defeat now seemed unavoidable. In the evening, McAuliffe sent a message simply stating, "We have been let down." Then, on December the 26th, the tanks of General Patton's 4th Armored Division punched a hole through the German siege and relieved Bastogne. The tide had turned, and there was further cause for celebration.
Isolated Bastogne was fed by airdrop. Medical supplies went in.
Clear skies meant the first airdrops, and that meant shells for the gunners. The town had been held, and it marked the beginning of the end of the Battle of the Bulge.
When Patton broke the siege, they then had the possibility to rearm, to get more weapons into Bastogne, more ammunition, more supplies, and they had the possibility to bring up additional forces to reinforce the situation.
The resistance of the black gunners and their comrades had bought the Allies precious time. After its early rapid gains in mid-December, the German offensive had become bogged down, its supply lines overstretched, its tanks out of fuel. Joachim Peiper's crack unit of King Tigers became trapped between two rivers. Unable to advance or retreat, he abandoned them and marched his men 20 kilometers to the German lines. The great breakout to seize Antwerp had failed.
The Battle of the Bulge stands to this day as the greatest battle in American history. It involved over 1 million men. Its cost was staggering. U.S. losses totaled over 10,000 killed, some 47,000 wounded, and an even more staggering figure of in excess of 22,000 missing in action. Most presumed into captivity, but many just lost and the bodies not recovered. German losses, it's difficult to know for sure, but they were certainly larger than those numbers.
As the Allied forces pushed the Germans back, the consequences of the offensive could now be assessed in detail. And the treatment by the SS of prisoners and civilians under Dietrich and Peiper became horrifyingly clear. In the town of Malmedy, some 20 kilometers from Bastogne, 86 American servicemen were murdered in cold blood by the men of Joachim Peiper's 1st SS Division. The following day, in the town of Stavelot, 93 Belgian civilians had been systematically executed, again by Peiper's men, charged with sheltering American servicemen. Among the dead were 23 children. And in one isolated spot in the Ardennes, one of the mysteries of the battle started to unravel. Some 6 weeks after the 11 black gunners of the 333rd had been arrested at Matthias Langer's farm and marched out of Wereth, the events that followed were revealed. Bodies, bearing the wounds of savage torture, bore testimony to the fate of the soldiers at the hands of their Nazi captors and the suffering inflicted on them before they died. The men's contorted faces exhibited multiple facial and jaw fractures. Fingers had been severed and legs broken. Bayonet wounds were present through the eye sockets. As the Allies pushed east and continued their drive into Germany, they liberated their prisoners of war, among them George Shomo and the remnants of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, who had fought so hard at the start of the invasion. But even now, safety would have to wait. As the black gunners were taken back to France to recover before returning home, George would face one more narrow escape. This time from the surgeons of his own side.
They took us to an airport and we flew out of Germany to France to a hospital camp. I remember hearing a couple of doctors talking about amputating my legs because I had trench foot real bad.
George was not about to go quietly. Having stood up to the Germans, it was now time to make a tactical retreat.
That's when I decided I was leaving and went and jumped on the back of a truck going to the docks, got on a Liberty ship and come on home. It was funny. I was on the boat, they called the roll, troops, and I never answered because my name wasn't on the list. And I remember an officer come and ask me what my name was, and I told him, "You aren't on this list." "Well, we can't send you back now. We're about 6 days out in the ocean." I tell you, when we came into Massachusetts, come out down the gangplank, and I hit the American soil, I bent down and kissed the ground. And I meant that. I was happy to be home.
The war may have been over for George, but for the families of the victims of the SS atrocities in the Battle of the Bulge, the pain would continue. They would have to wait till 1946 for Joachim Peiper, Joseph Dietrich, and the other SS perpetrators of the December murders to come to trial. A deposition by the prosecution revealed the extent of Hitler's desperation in secret orders issued just before the invasion.
This fight will be conducted stubbornly, with no regard for Allied prisoners of war, who will have to be shot if the situation makes it necessary.
Peiper and Dietrich were found guilty, and Peiper sentenced to death for his role in the Malmedy massacre. But his sentence was later commuted. If the relatives of the victims felt that justice had not been done, the families of the Wereth 11 had even more cause for dissatisfaction. The torture and murder of the 11 black gunners at a lonely spot in Wereth went unmentioned at the trial, and was again missing from the congressional report on the atrocities published 3 years later.
Whereas the perpetrators of the Malmedy massacre were all indicted, this didn't happen with the Wereth 11. This was actually suspiciously brushed under the table. When they discovered the details of the massacre, the higher command basically ignored it. And there were no subsequent prosecutions because of this. So no one was ever indicted for perpetrating this massacre.
It was not until 2004 that any memorial was erected to the Wereth 11. And when it came, it was at the instigation not of the American authorities, but a local man who had a very particular reason to remember the fate of the men who had died all those years before.
Donc nous sommes ici au Mémorial de Wereth, le US Memorial.
This cross was put up in the cemetery in 2004 by Hermann Langer and his family. It was Hermann who was 12 in 1944, and he saw at his house the 11 black soldiers who sought refuge for a little while at his house. All his life he'd been upset by the sight of these men, and never forgot them over the years, to the point that when he retired he was able to raise the money for a cross and establish a memorial here in order to preserve the memory of the 11 soldiers murdered by the SS.
And the soldiers of the 333rd had an additional reason to have mixed feelings about the legacy of the war. At the end of hostilities, the role of the Screaming Eagles, the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, was greatly celebrated. And recognition of the heroism of some of the black battalions was not slow to come either. But it carried a sting in its tail. For the 333rd, largely destroyed by the Germans, and arguably at the fiercest part of the fight, went unrewarded.
The 969th, which was our sister unit, they got a presidential citation at Bastogne, and that was it. 333rd got nothing. Everybody in the outfit was bitter about it. And this was years after we got out of the Army. I have no idea why the 333rd didn't get any recognition. They broke all kind of records over there for knocking out tanks and everything else, things that no other outfit ever done or could do, but yet we're not recognized for it. The black troops were the invisible soldiers.
The sacrifices made by African Americans in the Second World War are now finally being recognized in the United States. And in 2006, the first memorials to the Wereth 11 were erected.